In Magic, cards that let you damage your opponent directly tend to be red, and effects that make your opponent lose life tend to be black. However, in Magic's earlier days, blue actually regularly received cards that let you do direct damage to your opponent. In this video, we're going to look at mono blue cards that let you lower your opponent's life total directly with either direct damage or life loss, and we're going to rank them based on their level of success at Magic's highest level of competition. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. I use a scoring system, and first tier top 8s are worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and second tier top 8s are worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Before we get to the list proper, I do want to talk about one card that isn't on the list because I excluded it from consideration, even though it technically meets the requirements of this video, and that card is Parasitic Strix. For 2 generic and a blue, it's a 2/2 artifact creature with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, if you control a black permanent, target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So yeah, the Strix is technically mono blue, but because its enter the battlefield ability only triggers if you have a black permanent around it, is effectively a blue-black card. With 11 points, it would have made the list if I included it, because it was played in Legacy Aluren decks off and on between 2010 and 2021. Aluren lets you put creatures with mana value 3 or less into play for free, so if you combine the Strix with a bounce effect, like Cavern Harpy, you can kill your opponent with it in a single turn. Alright, now that we've got that out of the way, let's move to the list proper, starting with our number 10 card, which is Hermetic Study. For 1 generic and a blue, it's an enchantment aura with enchant creature, and the enchanted creature has tap. This creature deals 1 damage to any target. The effect this grants to a creature appears several times on this list, as creatures with this exact ability were the main way that blue was given direct damage effects for a long time. It's pretty great that this can also pick off small creatures in addition to being able to ping the opponent. Hermetic Study has gained all of its points in Pauper. That's a format where only commons are legal. It gets especially good in Simic decks running Death Touch creatures, as if you give this ability to Ambush Viper, tapping it now means you can not only ping your opponent, you can outright kill their creatures every time you tap it. It's also seen a bit of sideboard play, as it's a good thing to bring in against decks that are reliant on Delver of Secrets or other X1s. Hermetic Study hasn't gained any points since 2021 though. On most lists, that would mean that it's in danger of losing its spot, but because we basically never see this effect on blue cards anymore, there's a good chance it will still be on this list even if I revisit it in 5 years. At number 9, it's Maor. For 3 generic and 2 blue, it's a 3/3 flyer, and it can tap to do 1 damage to any target. Most of the creatures with this ability aren't very big, but Maor's 3/3 body can brawl pretty well, and once you reach a point where it can't attack, you can just start pinging stuff. It was pretty strong in block constructed, because the best deck in that format was mono red aggro, and it was reliant on lots of X1s like Jackal Pup. Maor could block the deck's main threats and then start picking them off. It was also played in standard opposition decks that used both opposition and static orb to lock the opponent out of the game, since you generally had to win by only untapping a couple of permanents a turn, and obviously enough Maor could do that job by slowly but surely damaging the opponent. It hasn't put up any top 8 since 2001 though. At number 8, it's Prodigal Sorcerer, who is probably the most iconic blue card that does direct damage. It's also one of the first cards that could ever do it since it was printed in Alpha. He's a fan favorite too, so much so that he has a nickname, with many players simply referring to him as Tim. He didn't actually see competitive play in Magic's earliest days, but as a result of a reprint he was fairly successful in the Standard of 2001, where like Maor he was played in opposition decks. He was actually used much more frequently than Maor was. He may not have been as good in combat, but he was a lot cheaper and easier to get in play before you locked down the game with opposition and static orb, but he hasn't gained any points since 2001. At number 7, it's Thorn Fairies, our 4th consecutive blue ping effect. For 1 generic and 2 blue, it's a 1/1 with flying, and it has the exact same activated ability as Prodigal Sorcerer. So it's a bit harder to cast than the Sorcerer, but the mana value is the same, and it comes with a pretty sweet keyword. The Fairies points have all come in Pauper, where it was a frequent sideboard card in mono blue aggro decks, one to be brought in against opponents reliant on X1s. The Fairies had some extra synergy in those decks too, since they frequently use Spell Stutter Sprite, which gets better the more Fairies you have, and Ninja of the Deep Hours, whose ninjutsu is easier to get going when you have a flyer around. While decks with that same core are still a thing in Pauper right now, The format has now passed Thorn Fairies by. At number 6, I've got Illusions of Grandeur. For 3 generic and a blue, it's an enchantment with cumulative upkeep for 2 generic. That means you have to pay 2 generic on your first upkeep after it's in play, then 4 and 6, and if you don't pay one of these costs, you sacrifice it. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 20 life, and when it leaves the battlefield, you lose 20 life. I think including this on the list will be a bit contentious, since it doesn't cause your opponent to lose life without some extra work, but it was only ever played in a deck that was all about making sure that happened. It was one of the key cards in an extended combo deck called Tricks, and this deck revolved around using Donate to give Illusions of Grandeur to your opponent, at which point they now have to worry about paying that cumulative upkeep cost, something they won't be able to do for very long, and once they fail to, Illusions makes them lose 20 life, and in most cases, lose the game. So it's effectively a blue burn spell that does 20 to the opponent, so it definitely belongs on the list. At number 5, it's Suq'Ata Firewalker, another pinger. This one costs 1 generic and 2 blue for a 0/1 that can't be the target of red spells or abilities from red sources, and it can tap for the usual ping effect. So while it has worse stats than all the blue pingers we've seen so far, the fact that cheap red spells can't remove it is a pretty big deal, and that was especially true in the extended of 1997 to 1998, which featured a lot of red decks. It hasn't gained a single point since 1998 though. At number 4, it's Psionic Blast. For 2 generic and a blue, it's an instant that does 4 damage to any target and 2 damage to you. Like Prodigal Sorcerer, the Blast's original printing is from Alpha, so it's one of the original blue damage spells, and it has a design that really doesn't feel blue, especially by today's standards, because not only does it do direct damage, it comes with the downside of damaging you. But this is something that appeared on a few blue cards back in the day. Anyway, 3 mana for a 4 damage instant is pretty potent, even when it comes with this kind of downside. It's efficient for removing creatures, and efficient for the amount of damage it can deal to your opponent, too. This led to it seeing play at Magic's very first World Championship in 1994, and a few years later it got a time-shifted reprint in Time Spiral that led to it seeing play in both Block and Standard. Notably, there's a color-shifted version of this card from original Ravnica, where it appeared as a red card, which makes a lot more sense for the more modern color pie. At number 3, it's Stinging Barrier. For 2 generic and 2 blue, it's a 0/4 with Defender, and you can pay 1 blue and tap it to do 1 damage to target creature or player. So unlike the other pingers we've seen so far, it asks for mana for the activated ability, but it's a much better blocker than its pinging brethren. It was a key card in Masks block constructed decks that were designed to defeat the format's insane Rebel decks. The top 8 at the only Masks block Pro Tour was made up of 6 Rebel decks and 2 mono blue decks using the Barrier. The Barrier was too big for most Rebels to attack through, it could pick off small Rebels, and it also worked really well alongside Rising Waters, a prison card in the deck that made it so players could only untap 1 land a turn. If you untap an island every turn with the Barrier in play, you're eventually going to be able to win the game with the ping ability. It performed in a similar role in Standard, where it was also played in the aforementioned Opposition Static Orb decks. It hasn't put up any top 8 since 2001 though. At number 2, it's Psychic Barrier. So we've got back-to-back barriers, although they are very different cards. For 2 blue mana, this is an instant that counters a spell and its controller loses 1 life. So by 2011, when Scars of Mirrodin block came out, WotC had decided that blue shouldn't be doing damage, but they did give it life loss effects, and usually incidental ones like on the Barrier. Of course, these days, blue doesn't even really get life loss effects, so we've moved even further away from blue being able to lower the opponent's life total with damage or life loss. Anyway, Psychic Barrier saw a little bit of play in standard blue-black control decks, and more recently it's been played in Pauper mono-blue aggro decks. If your blue deck is looking to turn creatures sideways and do damage, having a counterspell that helps you get there is pretty sweet. It's still putting up top finishes in Pauper right now, so it's going to keep gaining points, but it's never going to catch the number 1 card on the list, which is Vapor Snag. Like Psychic Barrier, it's from Scars of Mirrodin block, which again, is the last time we saw blue cards with this type of effect. For 1 blue mana, it's an instant that returns target creature to its owner's hand, and its controller loses 1 life. Vapor Snag is super efficient for what it does, resulting in it having seen play in a ton of formats, and generally in decks that are really interested in playing cheap spells to fill the graveyard and get back Arclight Phoenix or Trigger Prowess. When you have a board filled with Monastery Swiftspear and its ilk, Vapor Snag bouncing your opponent's blocker out of the way results in a pretty big turn. It's seeing play right now in both Modern and Pauper, and because blue doesn't get cards that qualify for this list anymore, I think it's going to hold on to the number 1 slot on this list for all of eternity. So those are the top 10 blue cards that lower your opponent's life. Do you want to build a blue burn deck? If so, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on past videos, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.
You